We are told that history started in the light with cities and kings appearing suddenly.
But the clay tablets buried under the dust in Iraq tell us a different story, one that started in the shadow of a great fall.
The ancient writers of Eridu didn't say they built their civilization by themselves. They wrote about the Abgalu, the 7 wise teachers, who came out of the waters of the Persian Gulf when the world was young.
For thousands of years, we have read these stories as myths, tales about fish people and magic. But if we listen carefully to the exact words they used, a more scary picture starts to show up. What if the gods didn't leave us because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else to go? The descriptions of these beings are strange, going against the natural order of that time.
The Babylonian writer Berosus wrote about Rannes, a teacher who walked among people during the day, but went back to the deep sea at night.
He described a body that was like a fish and like a man at the same time.
For many years, people saw this as symbolic.
But in the quiet of the desert, you might wonder, why would a sky being need to hide from the air of the very world he came to rule? The texts don't talk about magic spells, but about a physical need, a barrier between their nature and ours. It
suggests they had bodies that couldn't work well in the place where humans do great. There is a sadness in the Sumerian King List that people often miss. It records a time before the Great Flood when kings ruled for periods that seem impossible to us. Rules lasting tens of thousands of years. But as the centuries pass in the text, something sad happens.
The lifespans start to get shorter. They drop from thousands of years to hundreds and finally to the short life of a regular human.
It is as if the world itself didn't support them in the same way it supports us.
The environment seemed to become a heavy weight, a slow decay that tied
them to the ground they tried to control. The tablets talk about the me, the divine rules that controlled civilization.
In our modern pride, we often dismiss these as abstract laws, but the descriptions in the British Museum tablets paint them as physical objects, things that were brought down from heaven and could be held.
They are described as shining with a
brightness that was terrifying to see.
Yet over time, the texts described them slowly fading, though they never fully explain why.
The gods found themselves watching over a shrinking legacy, unable to replace what was lost.
And then there is the silence of the mountains. The Book of Enoch talks about Mount Hermon not as a temple, but as a point of no return. 200 watchers came down there, binding themselves with a promise.
The text calls it a rebellion, a fall from grace, but maybe it was something more desperate. The rebellion of the Igigi described in the Atrahasis epic wasn't just a refusal to work. It was the sadness of a group tied to a task that offered no way out.
They weren't just rulers. They were castaways stuck on a world that was slowly becoming their tomb. If the coming down was the beginning of their exile, the mountains were the walls of their prison.
The texts about the Igigi, the lesser beings who served the Anunnaki, paint a picture of trouble that spread across both heaven and earth. The
Book of Enoch describes a binding promise taken on the top of Mount Hermon, a place that stands tall in the land between modern Lebanon and Syria. For centuries, smart people have argued about why this specific mountain was chosen.
But studies of old buildings reveal something the texts only hint at: massive stone circles and huge stone bases that are older than the known history of that area.
These stones are fitted together with such exactness that it suggests they weren't
just monuments but working buildings, perhaps designed to look at stars that were becoming harder and harder to see. The rebellion described in the Atrahasis epic is often read as a work argument, a story of workers getting tired of their jobs, but the details suggest a bigger problem. The text says they set fire to their tools and surrounded the house of Enlil,
the ruler of the air. Why destroy the very tools they used for work, unless those tools no longer did what they needed?
Unless the connection to the upper heavens had already been cut off. The rebellion may not have been an act of going against rules, but a reaction to a silence that had fallen over their communications. The watchers were no longer watching.
They were waiting for a signal that never came.
This silence shows up in the buildings of that time. The great ziggurats of Mesopotamia, like the Anu ziggurat at Uruk, are amazing works of building, but their inside structure is confusing. They have rooms designed to vibrate with specific sound frequencies. The texts describe these not as places of quiet prayer, but as houses of the gods, where the divine voice could be heard.
One might ask, why build mountains of brick and sound?
Rooms if the gods could simply speak. The building of these huge sound boosters suggests a desperate try to bridge a growing gap to keep a link that was fading. The weakness of their situation is most clear in the story of the Tablets of Destinies. In the Epic of Anzu, these are not described as symbolic orders, but as objects that gave control over the rules of heaven and earth.
They shone like stars and had a power that could be stolen.
When the bird demon Anzu took them, the texts say
that brightness faded and silence fell on the divine council.
It is a description of a system going dark.
Without these tablets, the power of the Anunnaki was broken, leaving them weak on a planet they could no longer control.
As their power faded, they turned to a method that would change humanity forever. The Sumerian King List and the Atrahasis. Epic talk about the creation of a mixed family line, beings who were part earthly clay and part divine essence.
We are told this was to create workers, but there is another possibility one rarely talked about.
If their own bodies were failing, if the air of earth was slowly wearing down their life force, maybe they weren't creating servants.
Maybe they were trying to build heirs.
Containers able to hold their knowledge adapted to a world that had rejected them.
The text suggests that the trapping of the Watchers eventually led to a decision that would scar the earth itself. We know it as the
Great Flood, a story found in cultures around the world. But the Sumerian account of Ziusudra and the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh offer a view that is chilling in how practical it is. The disaster was not just a reaction to human sin.
It appears to have been a planned reset, a decision by the divine council to wash away a world that had become too messy to control.
The mixing of family lines and the sharing of knowledge without permission had created a reality the Anunnaki could no longer manage. The descriptions of the event in cuneiform
tablets are strikingly specific.
They don't describe a natural rainstorm.
Utnapishtim, the survivor in the Gilgamesh epic, tells how the gates of the heavens were opened and how the Anunnaki lit up the land with their lightning. The text talks about the weapons of the storm being unleashed by Enlil, suggesting a control of air forces far beyond what nature alone could do.
This wasn't weather.
It was a tool of destruction.
The old building record shows proof of this violence. Digging at the ancient city of Ur revealed an empty layer of clay 8 feet thick separating the layers of civilization, evidence of a sudden massive flood that wiped the slate clean.
But during the destruction, there was a desperate effort to save what mattered most. The instructions given to Ziusudra weren't simply to build a boat, but to build a vessel with exact math dimensions sealed with tar and pitch to make sure it was watertight.
The text describes a roof like the Apisu, implying a structure designed to survive being fully underwater by the violent waters. This wasn't a farmer's float. It was a survival
capsule, and its most precious cargo wasn't the farm animals but the divine rules.
The texts say that Enki, the guardian of wisdom, told Ziusudra to save the seed of mankind and the basic rules of civilization.
These may contain the formulas for kingship, the patterns of the stars, and the secrets of the crafts.
It suggests that the Watchers knew their buildings would be destroyed by the waters.
If they were to survive the aftermath on a ruined planet, they needed to save the blueprints of their knowledge. They couldn't upload it to a cloud. They had to physically
carry it through the storm.
This saving effort was mirrored in the lands of the Nile. The Egyptian pyramid texts talk about Thoth, the Lord of Wisdom, who understood that a great flood was coming.
The texts describe how he gathered the writings of the gods and hid them in the house of books and sealed rooms before the waters rose. This was a coordinated effort across the ancient world.
From the underground rooms of Egypt to the sealed vessel of Ziusudra, the goal was the same: to make sure that the memory of the first time didn't drown with the rest of the world. The flood was meant to end the mixing of worlds without permission.
But the knowledge, the very thing that made the Watchers powerful and dangerous, was snagged through the disaster, waiting to be found again by a world that had forgotten its true beginnings. When the waters finally went down, showing a land stripped of its former glory, the world had changed. The ancient texts suggest that the conditions of life itself had been changed. The Sumerian King List, which recorded the rules of the before-flood rulers in tens of thousands of years, changes its tone suddenly after the flood. The kings who ruled in the New World lived for centuries, then only decades. The curve of long life collapsed. It is as if a protective cover had been torn away, exposing both man and watcher to a harsh new reality. The environment that once kept the divine biology going was gone, replaced by a cycle of fast aging and decay. This change marks a big turning point in the relationship between humanity and its teachers. In the time before the disaster, the texts imply a closer nearness, a world where the Abgalu walked openly among the people. But in the after-flood era, a distance grows. The gods retreat. They pull back behind the high walls of the temple buildings into the Holy of Holies, the inner rooms where only the purified could enter. We're told this was for respect,
but the prison theory offers a darker meaning.
Maybe they pulled back, not out of pride, but out of need, if the air had indeed become hostile to their bodies.
The thick walls of the ziggurat and the stone rooms of the pyramid weren't just monuments, they were shields.
Yet civilization didn't start over from zero.
It came back with a sudden unexplainable complexity. Around 3500 BC, writing, complex math, and city planning appeared in Mesopotamia almost fully formed.
The cuneiform texts say this not to human invention, but to the help of the watchers who restored the me of all crafts. It was a reboot, a restoration, of the saved data from the survival vessels. But the teachers were different now.
They were weaker, fading shadows of the giants who had first come down. To keep control without exposing themselves to the wearing effects of the new world, they set up a system of helpers.
The kingship from heaven was handed down to human go-betweens.
These were the first priest kings, people who were prepared to stand in the presence of the divine.
The text describes ceremonies involving the physical handling of the tablets of destinies by these chosen humans. It suggests that the Anunnaki could no longer operate the machinery of control directly. They
needed human hands, genetically or ritually tuned, to work with the remains of their technology.
The tragedy of this era is easy to feel in the records. The improved abilities of the rulers, the height, the wisdom, the long life started to get less with each generation. The divine bloodline was getting weaker, washing away into the sea of general humanity. The gods were isolated in their stone boxes, watching their legacy fade, knowing that they were trapped on a dying path. They had saved the knowledge, but they couldn't save themselves. Across the desert, the same silence settled over the Nile Valley. We often view ancient Egypt as a civilization different from Sumer, but the texts buried in the sand tell a story of a mirror image.
The Egyptians had records of a first era they called Zep-Tepi, or the first time.
This wasn't a mythical dream, time, but a specific history period when the Neteru, the divine watchers, came down from the sky to start the throne of civilization. The Sumerian King List, a fragile paper that survived the ages, records the rules of these divine kings. Like the Sumerian kings, they ruled for thousands of years before the first human family line ever wore the crown. When we look closely at these Neteru, the faces become familiar. Pth, the creator god who shaped the world with his hands, is a near-perfect reflection of the Sumerian Enki, the master of crafts and water. I, who ruled the solar order, mirrors the authority of Anu. It suggests that the prison wasn't local.
It was planetary.
The same bosses were dividing the earth into territories, frantically trying to manage a world that was slipping from their grasp. But in the shadow of the pyramids, the desperation of the trapped gods took on a darker form. The pyramid texts carved into the walls of the earliest royal tombs have a passage known as the Cannibal Hymn.
It describes the pharaoh hunting and eating the divine essence of the gods to get their power and knowledge. For centuries, we have dismissed this as a barbaric symbol for spiritual strength.
But in the context of a dying breed of watchers, it hints at something more real. It suggests a religious transfer of biological material, a desperate attempt by the human rulers to take in the long life and ability that was fading from the bloodline of their masters. The buildings themselves show a need for protection that goes beyond the tomb.
The Giza Plateau isn't just a graveyard. It is a fortress of precision.
The underground rooms beneath the pyramids reveal building methods that mirror the deepest, oldest levels of Mesopotamia.
Huge granite blocks are fitted together with a closeness measured in tiny fractions of millimeters, an achievement that goes against the tools of the time.
Why build with such obsessive strength? Why hide these rooms deep inside the rock? It
looks like the logic of a bunker more than a monument. If the surface world had become hostile, whether through radiation, a change, or the violence of the elements, these sealed places offered a safe place.
They were static capsules designed to hold the Neteru in a state of frozen preservation, safe from the decay that waited outside. The pyramids may not have been built to send the soul to the stars, but to keep the body safe on an earth that had turned against its creators. The texts show that the quarantine of the Anunnaki wasn't perfect.
As their direct control slipped,
the knowledge they had, the me started to leak into the human population.
This wasn't always an approved transfer. The Book of Enoch, preserving ancient Mesopotamian traditions, describes a breaking of rules that scared the divine council. It talks about the Watcher Azazel and his group who taught men to make swords and knives and shields, and taught women how to use makeup and precious stones. We often read this as a moral story about vanity and violence.
But strip away the religious
language and you see a technology transfer.
They were teaching metalworking and chemistry. They were showing the secrets of changing matter, how to turn rock into metal and minerals into chemicals. In the context of the prison theory, this was a breaking of rules. The gods weren't supposed to give weapons to the prisoners. By giving
humanity the tools of destruction and creation, the rebel watchers were maybe trying to speed up our development, to create a civilization able to fix the very machines they could no longer repair. To stop this leak, the remaining authority set up a new system of control, the mystery schools. In the shadow of the great ziggurats of Babylon and Borsippa, a strict order was formed. Knowledge was no longer given freely. It was hoarded. The cuneiform tablets describe an initiated priesthood who guarded the secrets of the gods with their lives. These weren't just religious rituals.
The lessons included advanced math, astronomy, and the formulas of the Abgalu. This was the birth of
the secret society.
The knowledge of the first time, the geometry of the pyramids, the cycles of the stars, the making of metal mixtures was broken into pieces and hidden inside riddles. The students were sworn to silence, a tradition that would echo through the
ages, from the Chaldeans to the Hermeticists and eventually to the West.
They became the keepers of a flame that wasn't theirs, guarding a science they didn't invent, but only preserved.
The tragedy is that humanity was left with the instruction manuals, but not the teachers.
We built our civilization on the ruins of theirs, using the math and astronomy they left behind to chart a sky they could no longer reach. The gods had pulled back into the silence of their safe rooms, leaving us to play with fire advanced ideas of law, building, and war that we are still struggling to master today.
The prison had become a classroom, but the lesson plan was lost in the flood.
As the great empires of the ancient world rose and fell, the direct presence of the Watchers faded into memory, but their shadow remained cast over the human mind. The knowledge they had saved in the house of books didn't disappear. It changed shape. When the temples of Babylon were finally left empty, the formulas of the Abgalu were carried west to the new thinking center of the world, Alexandria. Here, the exact instructions for metalworking and material engineering were translated from cuneiform into Greek, owing through a strange change.
What was once a technical manual for creating mixtures and compounds became the mysterious poetry of alchemy.
We think of alchemists as wizards trying to turn lead into gold through magic. But if we look at the texts they studied, a different truth comes out. The Hermetic traditions named after Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek echo of Thoth, have geometric rules and chemical recipes that mirror the metalworking knowledge of ancient Mesopotamia.
They weren't casting spells. They were trying to copy an advanced chemistry they no longer fully understood.
They were following the recipes of the gods without the original equipment to cook them, searching for the philosopher's stone that could purify matter, just as the Anunnaki had once purified the clay. But as the knowledge changed, so did the view of the teachers.
In the early days of Eridu, the Watchers were praised as bringers of civilization. But by the time of the Gnostics, centuries later, the mood had turned. The Gnostic texts don't talk about kind gods. They talk about the archons, rulers who patrol the boundaries of the earth, keeping the divine spark of humanity trapped in a material prison. It is a chilling parallel. The Gnostics described these archons as having the shapes of beasts and being obsessed with control, a dark reflection of the Igigi and their watching.
The prison planet was no longer just a physical reality for the Watchers.
It had become a spiritual reality for humanity.
The Gnostics believed that these beings were not the creators of the supreme light, but only the jailers of this world, jealous beings who wanted to keep humans ignorant of their true potential. This shift in identity spread through the religious world. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch, once the technology teachers of Mount Hermon, became the fallen angels of later tradition. The rebellion of the Igigi was reinterpreted as the war in heaven. The beings who had come down to fix a broken system were now seen as demons who had corrupted it. The memory of the living connection had been cut, and in the darkness, the abandoned crew of the colony were changed into the monsters under the bed of Western civilization.
And now, thousands of years later, we are left with the silence.
The physical giants described in the texts, the beings who walk the halls of Eridu, have faded into the earth.
But the ancient writers insist that something remained. The Atrahasis.
Epic doesn't talk about a simple disappearance, but of merging. It describes the blood of a god mixed with the clay of the earth to create a new family line.
For centuries, smart people have treated this as a symbol for the soul.
But the Sumerian King List records a strange lasting.
Long after the flood,
there were rulers who claimed to come from this mixed family.
kings who try to get back the long life and wisdom of the first time.
These claims aren't verified by modern science, but they haunt the history record. The Turin Papyrus in Egypt lists Shemsu Hr, the followers of Horus, who ruled for thousands of years before the pharaohs. Who were these followers? The texts describe them as the bridge between the Neteru and humanity, the guardians of a knowledge
that was slowly slipping away.
They were the keepers of the me, trying to maintain the civilization of the gods in a world that no longer supported it. The thinking legacy they guarded is equally unsettling.
We find math tablets like Plimpton 322 hidden in the dust of the old Babylonian period, having trigonometric calculations that seem out of place in their time. The Venus tablets of Amisaduka track the planets with an exactness that suggests an
inheritance rather than a discovery.
It is as if humanity was given the user manual for a machine we didn't build.
Formulas for the stars, recipes for the earth, saved by a priesthood who remembered the teachers. Even as the teachers pulled back into the shadows, the division of the earth, the silence of the ziggurats, the getting shorter of the king's lives.
It all points to a slow, painful conclusion. The golden cage of the Anunnaki didn't burst open with a dramatic escape. It seems to have rusted shut.
The texts don't tell us that they found a way home.
There is no tablet that records a triumphant return to the stars.
Instead, the voices of the gods simply grow quieter. The instructions become fewer. The shining objects stop glowing.
We are left with a landscape of ruins and a history of pieces.
The great sound rooms of Uruk stand silent, their frequencies untuned.
The huge stones of Baalbek and Giza stay where they were placed, monuments to an ability that was lost.
The prison theory offers a possibility that is maybe more haunting
than abandonment.
It suggests that they are not watching us from a distant star, but that they simply faded into the fabric of the world they were forced to live in.
Did they eventually give in to the biological trap of Earth?
Or do they remain hidden in the forbidden places mentioned in the Kudru stones, waiting for the environment to change once more? The cuneiform tablets offer no final chapter. They
end in lists of kings and prayers for mercy. We are left standing in the wreckage of their golden cage, holding the keys they carved for us, looking up at a sky that remains stubbornly silent.
And we are forced to wonder, are we the heirs of their kingdom?
Or are we simply the guardians of their tomb?
If the Anunnaki were indeed stranded, unable to physically return to the heavens, their buildings tell the story of a desperate try to keep the line open.
We look at the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki of Babylon, the White Temple of Uruk as religious monuments, but the cuneiform writings describe them differently. They are called Dur.and.ki, the bond of heaven and earth. This bond wasn't just spiritual.
The text suggests it was a working connection that needed exact engineering to keep going.
The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, dating back to the dawn of writing, rises in 7 different levels, each pointed to specific star arrangements.
But it is the inside structure that goes against simple explanation.
Study of old buildings has revealed rooms within these huge mounds that have specific sound properties.
These weren't empty rooms. The design creates vibration, making sound bigger in ways that mirror the rules of harmonic vibration. The texts describe priests using these sound rooms to help communication between the earthly bosses and the sky authorities. Why would a god need a megaphone?
If they were all powerful, a whisper should have been enough.
The building of these huge vibration engines suggests the opposite, an ability that was fading.
It paints a picture of a stranded colony trying to boost a signal that was getting weaker by the century. The Babylonian texts talk about the house of the gods where the deity would appear, but only when the rituals and maybe the sounds were
perfect. As the thousands of years passed, the ziggurats grew larger, the brickwork more huge, as if they were trying to make up for a silence that was slowly covering the world. As the bond of heaven grew silent, the look of the watchers turned downward. If the surface of the earth had become a biological trap, a place of radiation, or a heaviness that shortened their lives, then the underground offered a safe place.
The domain of Enki was always known as the Abzedu, the underground ocean.
For a long time, smart people viewed this as a mythical underworld, but digging at the ancient religious center of Nippur have uncovered something that feels closer to a bunker than a myth. Under the ruins of the Enlil temple, trips discovered a set of underground rooms going far deeper than needed for any known ritual purpose.
These weren't burial places. They were equipped with fancy air systems designed to keep air moving in a
sealed space. The walls of these deep places have carvings of mechanical devices, pictures that look less like religious art and more like air monitoring equipment. The texts about Enlil talk about his ability to control the winds and move the air masses. In the context of a prison planet, these underground control centers take on a chilling logic. They weren't hiding from demons, they were hiding from the sun. The deeper they went, the more stable their environment became. The Abzu of Enki at Eridu is described similarly, with foundations reaching deep into the water table connected by a
network of channels carved through solid rock with math precision.
It suggests that in the final eras of their presence, the gods became cave dwellers of their own making, ruling from the shadows of the earth because they could no longer stand the light of the sky. If the ziggurats were their voices, then the
stone circles and temple alignments were their eyes. Throughout Mesopotamia and Egypt, we find a focus on the stars that goes beyond simple farming.
The building of these sites reveals a deep worry about time and position.
The Nana ziggurat at Ur, for example, lines up exactly with the lunar standstill cycle, a complex space event that happens only once every 18.6 years. The math calculations needed to predict this alignment suggest access to data covering centuries of watching, or maybe a memory of star mechanics brought from somewhere else.
The texts divide the sky into three great paths: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, and the way of Enki. These weren't just poetic names,
they were navigation corridors.
The Enlil temple at Nippur has alignments to stars in the northern hemisphere tied to air control. But the most haunting detail is the knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. Regular history tells us this wobble of the earth was discovered by the Greeks, but the cuneiform tablets such
as the astrolabe of Amisaduca have calculations that mirror this long count with scary accuracy.
Why would a civilization just coming out of the Stone Age need to track a cycle that covers thousands of years? In the context of the prison theory, this wasn't exploration.
It was a countdown.
They were tracking the shifting position of the stars, compared to a home they could no longer see, marking the passage of an exile that had no end.
The exactness of their monuments wasn't a celebration of their power, but a stone map of their isolation. As the Golden Age dissolved and the environment of Earth took its toll, the Anunnaki faced a crisis of who would rule next.
They could no longer rule openly. The texts describe a change of power known as the kingship from heaven, where authority
was formally given to human go-betweens. But this wasn't a simple crowning.
The rituals described in the text when Anu the Sublime involved the physical handling of the tablets of destinies by these chosen representatives. These ceremonies were dangerous. Old building evidence from the throne room at Mari reveals a platform
with metal inlays that show signs of intense heat exposure, suggesting that the turning on of these symbols involved energy releases that ordinary humans couldn't survive.
The priest kings selected for this duty weren't random. The Sumerian King List implies they were prepared or improved to survive the contact.
Yet even these selected lines started to fail.
The improved abilities, the long life, and the wisdom got less with each passing generation.
To save them, as
the biological connection faded, the knowledge was moved into the shadows.
The Babylonian mystery schools came out within the temples of Marduk and Nabu.
Here, the students were sworn to secrecy, guarding the math and space formulas of the Abgalu, not as religious rules, but as the survival codes of a civilization that had gone dark. The gods had left the stage, and humanity was left holding a
script written in a language we were just starting to forget.
The texts talk about knowledge leaking from the temples, but sometimes physical objects themselves slip through the scraps of history.
If the Watchers had a technology that was failing, we would expect to find debris, pieces of tools that don't fit the Bronze Age, and in the dusty corners of museum collections, we find exactly that.
The Nemrud lens discovered in the Assyrian palace of Nemrud is a piece of rock crystal ground to an exact curved shape. Regular Old Things study labels it a decorative inlay, but its optical properties allow it to work as a magnifying lens able
to correct astigmatism or maybe look at the stars.
Why would a civilization carve such a thing if they didn't understand optics?
It sits in the British Museum, a silent proof of a science that was known, used, and then forgotten.
The same strange thing appears in metalworking. The texts of the Abgalu talk about formulas for purification and mixture creation.
We find copper and bronze objects from the early periods that show chemical makeups needing temperatures and purification processes that should have been impossible for the time. These weren't accidental discoveries.
They were the result of specific recipes.
Recipes that the texts say were brought down from heaven before the flood.
They are the rusting leftovers of a making base that no longer exists, tools left behind
by a workforce that has long since clocked out.
We have traced the story from the first coming down at Eridu to the silence of the great stone platforms. The story that comes out from the cuneiform tablets is not one of triumphant gods who flew
away when their work was done. It is a tragedy of being trapped.
They arrived with the power to shape the earth, but the earth slowly shaped them in return. It stripped them of their long life, broke their machines, and forced them to hide in the shadows of their own temples.
The golden cage idea suggests that the gods didn't abandon us.
They simply faded.
To me, the great technology rules were given to human hands piece by piece as the original owners lost the ability to use them.
We, the mixed family line, became the guardians of their files.
Today we look at the ruins of Baalbek and the pyramids of Giza and feel a strange familiarity.
Maybe it is because they were built by builders who were trapped here just like us. They looked up at the same stars, charted the same precession, and felt the same isolation. The silence of the ancient world isn't empty.
It is heavy with the presence of those who stayed.
And as we start to unlock the secrets of the atom and the genes, we are not discovering new things.
We're simply remembering the codes they left in
the lock, waiting for the day we would be taught enough to turn the key.
If the gods were pulling back, trying to save a legacy, they could no longer keep going. We should find evidence of a planned shutdown. And in the highlands of Turkey at a place called Göbekli Tepe, we find exactly that.
For decades, history told us that civilization began in Sumer around 4000 BC, but the huge stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe push that date back to 9500 BC, a time when humans were supposed to be primitive hunters.
Yet the relief carvings on these pillars tell a different story.
They show beings that look remarkably like the watchers of Mesopotamia, tall figures different from the ordinary people standing with a quiet authority. But the mystery of Göbekli
Tepe isn't just in its building. It is in its leaving.
The site wasn't destroyed by war or worn down by time. It was buried. The builders took incredible care to cover their work with tons of soil, sealing the area as if closing a time capsule. Why would a primitive culture spend decades building a temple only to bury it? The prison theory suggests a practical answer. If the Watchers knew that a disaster was coming, the same flood described in the texts, or if they were leaving an outpost that was no longer safe, burial was the only way to protect the stone files.
They weren't hiding the site from the gods.
They were hiding it from the coming storm, leaving it in the darkness until a future generation could uncover it.
The buildings of this first time have a signature that is impossible to ignore.
Wait, across the ancient world, from the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek to the fortress walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, we find stones of mind-bending size.
In Lebanon, there are blocks weighing hundreds of tons, some guessing nearly 1,000 tons, lifted and placed with an exactness that goes against explanation.
Regular old thing study suggests ropes and pulleys, but the pure physics of friction and gravity makes this unlikely for a Bronze Age culture. The texts of the Abgalu and the Watchers offer a different view.
They talk about formulas and the
mastery of natural forces. If the Anunnaki were indeed trapped here, stripped of their high-tech flight ability, they would still have the knowledge of engineering rules that we have yet to rediscover.
The trilithon stones of Baalbek were placed
there to impress the locals. They formed a platform. In the context of the texts, these huge foundations looked like landing pads or stable bases for heavy equipment, remains of a structure that needed stability on a rock scale. The tools are gone, but the foundations remain too heavy to be moved,
standing as silent proof of an ability that left no other trace.
The story of the seven sages, the Abgalu who brought civilization, isn't unique to the Tigris and Euphrates.
If we look across the ocean to the Americas, the echo is unmistakable.
The Aztec legends talk about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent,
who arrived from the sea, bringing knowledge of math, astronomy, and farming. He's described as a tall, bearded figure, unlike the local population who eventually left with a promise to return.
This mirrors the description of Uranus in Babylon, almost perfectly.
In the Andes, the figure of Virakaka plays the same role, a bringer of civilization who walked the lands after a great flood, restoring order and teaching the arts of stone cutting.
The seven caves of Aztec origin myths known as Kikimoctic have a striking resemblance to the underground rooms of the Near East. The sameness of these stories suggests that the Watchers didn't just stay in one place.
As their global grid broke apart, they may have spread out, attempting to reboot civilization in isolated pockets.
The pyramids of Teotihuacan and the ziggurats of Ur are not just similar in shape.
They are similar in function. both serving as fake mountains to reconnect with a sky that had gone silent. As the gods poured back into the underground rooms of
the Abzu, a practical question comes up. How did they see in the dark? The soot of torches is missing from many of the deepest, most detailed tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the underground cities of Anatolia. The detailed paintings and carvings were made in places where fire would have used up the oxygen. But in the dusty basement of the Baghdad Museum, a small simple object offers a different answer.
Known as the Baghdad Battery, it's a clay jar having a copper cylinder and an iron rod.
Old thing experts have proven that if filled with an acidic liquid, it makes a steady electrical current. For decades, we have dismissed this as a curiosity, maybe used for coating jewelry with metal. But in the context of the prison theory, it takes on a new importance.
If the Anunnaki had advanced knowledge of light and energy, the very things described as the brightness of the divinity, maybe these rough batteries weren't inventions of discovery, but inventions of desperation. They may represent a cargo cult. Try to recreate the light sources they once controlled, a fading civilization using clay and vinegar to spark a memory of the power they had lost.
The loss of the divine rules, was terrible, but the knowledge of the stars had to be saved.
For centuries, we believed that the Greeks invented complex mechanics,
but the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism shattered that timeline.
This detailed bronze computer found from a shipwreck tracks the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the planets with an exactness that would not be seen again for 1,000 years. It calculates the very same Saurus eclipse cycles and lunar standstills that were obsessively recorded by the priests of Babylon. The device is a strange thing. It appears in history without something before it, fully formed.
But if we view it through the lens of the Sumerian texts, it is not an invention.
It is a making smaller.
The great stone observatories of the ziggurats were unmovable.
As the watchers and their knowledge spread out, they needed a way to carry the heavens with them.
This mechanism might be the physical form of the Tablet of Destinies, a portable version of the great space computers that once controlled their navigation.
It is a clockwork map for a species that was no longer allowed to travel, a mechanical way to remember the orbits of a home they could no longer see.
If the watchers were indeed grounded, stripped of their ability to fly, they left behind a legacy that suggests they once had a very different viewpoint.
The Piri Resh map drawn in 1513 has details that have confused mapmakers for centuries.
It shows the coast of South America with startling accuracy and more mysteriously appears to show the coastline of Antarctica free of ice.
The admiral who drew it admitted he didn't chart it himself. He put it together from ancient Thor's maps rescued from the Library of Alexandria. How could ancient writers know the shape of a continent buried under ice for millions of years? How could they chart the curve of the Earth with such exactness? Before the invention of timekeepers, the text of the Igigi, the watchers who see from above, offer a chilling explanation. These maps weren't drawn by explorers sailing on the water.
They were drawn by watchers looking down from the sky. They are the surviving flight charts of the first time, saved and copied by generation after generation of priests who no longer
understood what they were copying.
They are the final visual record of the world as it looked before the prison doors slammed shut. The most close legacy of the watchers isn't found in the stone of the pyramids, but in the descriptions of the rulers themselves.
The Atrahasis epic is clear. Let one god be killed, and with his flesh and his blood, let Ninta mix clay. For thousands of years, this was read as a story of creation. But in the context of a stranded civilization, it reads like a medical procedure. If they couldn't survive here in their original form, they needed a container that could.
The texts talk about the heroes of old, the men of renown who walked the earth after the flood. These were the hybrid kings, people who had a life force that the common man didn't.
But the ancient records also hint at a cost. This blood of the gods wasn't compatible with the earth.
The Sumerian King List shows the fast decay of their lifespans as if the earthly environment was rejecting the skycraft. It suggests that the
prison wasn't just outside, it was inside.
They had locked their own essence into bodies that were meant to wither, trapping an immortal memory in a mortal frame. As the biological connection faded, the physical presence of the watchers vanished from the history record.
But the legends of their leaving are strangely inconsistent.
They don't describe a mass leaving. Instead, they talk about pulling back into the hidden places, the Abzu, the hollow mountains, the rooms of rest. In the traditions of the Near East, there is a lasting belief that the seven sages didn't die, but entered a state of suspension. The Kudiru boundary stones warn that certain peaks and caverns belong to the gods and are forbidden to men. Maybe this wasn't a territorial claim, but a quarantine.
If the environment of the surface had become toxic to them, the deep earth offered a shield.
The prison theory suggests that they may still be here in the silence of the underground world described in the texts of Enki, waiting in a sleep that covers thousands of years, while the civilization they jump-started grows noisy above their heads. We have spent 5,000 years digging for their bones, but maybe we are looking at the evidence upside down. We see the pyramids, the ziggurats, and the great walls of Sacsayhuaman as monuments to human achievement.
But their exactness, their
alignment, and their pure mass suggests they were built for a purpose we have forgotten. They stand like abandoned machines on a factory floor, silent gears in a planetary engine that no longer turns.
The divine formulas are still with us. We use their geometry to build our skyscrapers. We use their astronomy to navigate
our ships.
We use their division of time to mark our days. We're using the tools they left behind, unaware of the hands that held them first. The tragedy of the Anunnaki is not that they were destroyed, but that they were forgotten by the very children, a race to be their guardians. We are the keepers of a house we don't remember building.
The story of the Anunnaki ends not with
a period, but with a question mark.
The cuneiform tablets break off.
The papyri crumble. The voices of the gods in the texts fall silent, but the sky they watched so obsessively is still there. The procession they mapped continues to turn.
The
golden cage of Earth remains a closed system, a beautiful, lonely blue marble in the dark. Did they eventually find a way to leave, or did they simply fade into the pattern of the world, their consciousness dissolving into the collective mind of humanity? The ancient writers offer no comfort.
They leave us standing at the gates of the ziggurat, looking up at the empty platform where the gods once stood.
We are left with the haunting possibility that the prison of the gods was never opened.
It was simply inherited. And maybe as we reach for Mars and the stars beyond, we're not exploring the universe.
We're simply trying to do what they couldn't escape.
As the isolation of the Anunnaki stretched into centuries, the tension between the rival groups reached a breaking point. The texts don't describe a peaceful living together in their exile. They describe a fall into savagery, but a savagery fought with the tools of gods. The Sumerian epic Lugui describes the warrior god Ninurta using a weapon called Shera. This object is described as a hunter that could fly across huge distances, communicating with its user and unleashing a venom that dissolved stone and flesh alike. We have understood these accounts as mythological symbols for thunder and lightning, but the descriptions are too specific. The text says the weapon roared like a storm and poured out fire that burned the earth, leaving behind a poison that made the water undrinkable. In the context of the prison theory, this wasn't magic. It was the turning on of the remaining stockpile. The stranded groups were turning their engineering tools into weapons, using the me of distraction to secure territory in a world where resources were limited. The gods weren't just dying of old age, they were killing each other. The peak of this conflict is recorded in one of the most haunting texts of the ancient world. The Lament for Yor describes the end of the Sumerian civilization around 2000 BC, not by invasion, but by a great storm sent by Anu and Enlil. But this was no ordinary weather event. The text clearly states that it was an evil wind that carried no rain, a wind that burned the heavens and caused the people to drop dead in the streets without visible wounds. The descriptions are chillingly familiar to the modern ear. The tablet says, the people in their own houses were piled into heaps. The land was poisoned. The water was bitter. It describes a heat that stripped the skin from the body. This evil wind drifted over the land, invisible and silent, killing everything it touched. If the Anunnaki used weapons that released invisible poisons or radiation, remains of a technology they could no longer control, then the fall of Yor wasn't a judgment. It was a fallout. It marks the moment when the Cold War of the gods turned. Heart and humanity became the accidental damage of a suicide pact. Evidence of this ancient destruction may still lie scarred into the landscape. To the west of the Sumerian cities in the Sinai Peninsula, there is a crack in the earth that goes against rock explanation. The bedrock appears burned and the stones are blackened as if exposed to an intense sudden heat. The texts of the Wars of the Gods talk about a final fight at the place of the chariots, a spaceport or connection point that was destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. If the prison couldn't be escaped, the rival groups made sure that no one else could control the keys. The destruction of this structure was the final act of sabotage. By destroying the launch sites or the communication hubs, they sealed their own fate permanently. The black scar in the desert isn't just a rock strange thing.
It is the burn mark of the door being welded shut. After this event, the great sky vehicle stopped appearing in the texts.
The wings of the gods were clipped, not by the air but by their own hands. The destruction described in the Lament for Yor wasn't an isolated incident. If we listen to the echoes from the Indus Valley, we hear the same terrifying sounds of a war fought with technologies we're only just starting to imagine.
The ancient Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, described the Vimanas, flying palaces that navigated the sky as easily as a bird. For centuries, these were dismissed as flights of fancy, but their technical descriptions are scarily specific, detailing movement by Mercury and a wind that was created by engines rather than
wings. But it is the weaponry that lines up so chillingly with the Sumerian Shera. The texts talk about a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It describes an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns, a column of smoke and fire that rose like a parasol. The aftermath is described not as a battlefield, but as a poisoned land.
The hair and nails of the survivors fell out.
The water became hot.
The birds turned white.
These are not the descriptions of arrows and spears.
They are the clinical symptoms of radiation poisoning, recorded thousands of years before the atom was split.
The prison wasn't just a cage.
It was a battleground where the inmates burned the very earth they were trapped on.
The physical evidence of this ancient heat is harder to erase than the texts. Across the globe, we find strange things. In the stone that suggests temperatures far going beyond a simple wood fire. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan, old thing experts have found skeletons lying in the streets holding hands struck down in an instant. The clay parts around them were melted into glass.
This event, known as vitrification, needs heat of over 1,500 degrees Celsius, temperatures that can't be achieved by a burning thatch roof. We see the same scars in the vitrified forts of Scotland and the blackened stones of the Arabian Peninsula.
The rocks are fused together, not by paste, but by a flash of heat so intense it melted the granite. The war of the gods left its fingerprints in the rocks itself. These glass scars are the fulgurites of a man-made lightning, the permanent shadows.
They stand as silent witnesses to a moment when the sky burned and the civilization of the Watchers tore itself apart. The silence that followed this destruction was deep.
In the aftermath of these great wars, the descriptions of flight in the air stop. The Vimanas disappear from the skies of India. The skyboats of Egypt are no longer seen. The Shem of the Mesopotamians become symbolic stone towers rather than working vehicles. It suggests that the structure of flight was the main victim of the conflict, whether through the destruction of the spaceports, the using up of fuel, or the loss of the technical knowledge needed to keep the craft going. The result was the same. The gods were grounded. The heavens became a memory. The surviving Watchers were forced to walk the earth they once looked at from above. The destruction of their transport ability was the final lock on the prison door.
They were no longer travelers. They were refugees stranded on a planet they had poisoned, left to rule over the ashes of their own war.
With their machines broken and their numbers getting smaller, the Watchers turned to the only resource they had left, biology. The texts of the Atrahasis epic describe the creation of humanity as a solution to a work crisis, a way to relieve the iggy of their hard work. But the Book of Enoch describes a second, more controversial mixing.
It talks about the Watchers taking wives from among the humans and having children who were unlike anything the earth had seen before.
We often romanticize this as a story of forbidden love, but the prison theory suggests a colder reason.
If the Anunnaki themselves were physically getting weaker in the Earth's air, they needed a new vessel, a go-between class that had the strength
of the gods but the biological toughness of humans. These offspring, known in Hebrew as the Nephilim, weren't born of passion. They were born of necessity. They were designed to be the enforcers, the heavy lifters, and maybe the soldiers in the wars for resources. The binding promise on Mount Hermon wasn't a wedding vow.
It was a pact to break the genetic firewall in a desperate try to make a future.
The experiment, however, appears to have been terrible. The texts don't describe these hybrids as kind rulers. The Book of Enoch describes them as great giants who ate all the acquisitions of men.
And when men could no longer support them, they turned against humanity itself.
This reads like a biological description of an invasive species, an organism with eating demands that the local ecosystem couldn't support. The giant legends found in every corner of the world, from the Anakim of Canaan to the Quinametsin of the Aztecs, share a common theme: hunger and instability. These beings were powerful, but they were biologically expensive. They needed more food, more space, and more control than the fragile after-flood world could provide.
Instead of saving the colony, the creation of the Nephilim sped up its collapse.
They became a chaotic variable, a biological weapon that the Watchers could no longer control, forcing the very destruction. The great flood that was meant to wipe the slate clean and erase the mistake.
Why don't giants walk the earth today? The answer may lie in the genetics of the hybrid.
In nature, cross-species breeding often results in sterility. The mule is strong, but it has no future.
The ancient texts suggest a similar dead end for the offspring of the Watchers.
While the Sumerian King List records the demigods ruling for long periods, their lifespans crash with terrifying speed. The divine essence wasn't a permanent gift.
It was a decaying isotope.
The line of the Nephilim
didn't fade because they were hunted to extinction. It faded because it was biologically unsustainable.
The blood of the gods was too strong, or maybe too alien, to stabilize within the human genome over many generations. The mighty men of old were a single-generation event, a flash of genetic brilliance that burned itself out. The Watchers watched
their children die, not by the sword, but by the slow, relentless math of biology.
The experiment had failed. They were trapped in a world that would not accept their seed, leaving them with no heirs to the stars, only the silent, smaller humanity that would eventually inherit the ruins. If the Watchers were scattered after the Great Wars, we would expect to find their footprints in the east. In the ancient chronicles of China, the Shiji, we read of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. Like the sages of Sumer, he appears suddenly, bringing
fully formed knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and math to the tribes of the Yellow River Valley.
But it is the description of his arrival that lines up so closely with the Anunnaki story. He didn't come from the earth.
He came down from the skies in a chariot that could cover great distances in a single day. The texts talk about his mirrors,
which were made of unknown metals, and his tripods, which hummed with a strange power.
Huangdi is described not just as a ruler, but as a technician of the divine. He taught the people how to regulate the flow of water and track the stars, the same
described in Mesopotamia, but the story ends in mystery.
It is said that after his work was done, a dragon came down from the sky to collect him.
Some texts say he mounted it and flew away. Others say he died before he could leave and only his clothes were buried in his tomb. The unclearness echoes the tragic fate of the Watchers, a leader trying to return to the heavens, maybe leaving behind only the empty shell of his authority. Across the huge silence of the Pacific, the jungles of Mesoamerica hide a similar
memory. The Maya and the Aztecs worshipped a figure known as Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, the feathered serpent.
Standard history treats this as a purely mythological creature, but the oral traditions describe him as a physical being, a tall bearded man, with white skin and deep eyes, appearance completely alien to the local people of the region. He arrived from the sea bringing the arts of civilization, farming, stone building, and the complex calendar systems that track the precession of the equinoxes. He was a teacher, a sage in the style of the Sumerian Abgalu.
But his story is one of exile.
The legends say he was driven out by a rival god, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a conflict that mirrors the rivalry between Enlil and Enki.
Quetzalcoatl left on a raft of serpents, promising to return.
This promise became the central tragedy
of the Aztec world, a cargo cult waiting for a pilot who had been grounded.
The feathered serpent may not have been a monster, but a memory of the vehicle he arrived in, a craft that could fly like a bird and strike like a snake, etched into the cultural memory of a people watching from the ground. High in the Andes of Bolivia at an altitude where the air is thin and cold, lie the ruins of Pumapunku. This site goes against the logic of the Bronze Age even more aggressively than the pyramids. Here, scattered like children's blocks, are huge
slabs of andesite and gyrite, stones so hard they can only be cut by diamond. Yet they are not just cut, they are machined.
The H-blocks found at the site have perfect right angles, exact real holes and connecting joints that suggest a level of standardization found in modern factories. There are no idols here, no writings of praise. The stark geometric nature of
the ruins suggests a function that was useful, not religious.
In the context of the prison theory, Pumapunku looks less like a temple and more like a ruined industrial place.
Was this a place for processing ore, a chemical plant, or maybe a
launch site that was destroyed during the Wars of the Gods? The Aymara legends say the site was built in a single night by the gods who floated the stones through the air with the sound of a trumpet.
It is the lasting memory of a technology that used sound to overcome gravity, left rusting in the stone.
Silence of the Altiplano. If the surface of the earth had become a hostile environment for the Watchers, whether through the evil wind of their wars or the slow decay of their biology, then the only logical move was downward. In the volcanic rock of Cappadocia at a place called Derinkuyu, we find evidence of a pulling back on a huge scale. This is not a cave.
It is a buried city carved 18 levels deep into the earth, able to shelter 20,000 people along with their farm animals and supplies.
The engineering mirrors the descriptions of Enlil's temple at Nipah, where digging revealed underground rooms going far deeper than needed for religious purposes. Like the temple complex, Derinkuyu has fancy air shafts that bring air to the deepest levels, an achievement of fluid dynamics that ensures breathable oxygen even miles underground. Why would a primitive culture go to such lengths to hide from the sky? The prison theory suggests that this was a radiation shield or an airlock. The huge stone doors rolling into place to seal the corridors from the inside weren't designed to keep out bandits. They were designed to seal the colony against a world that had become poisonous to its masters. The Sumerian texts have always been clear about the division of the world. Enlil ruled the surface, but Enki ruled the Abzu, the deep watery abyss.
Under the earth, for centuries, we treated this as a mythological underworld, a symbol for death.
But the physical reality of places like Derinkuyu suggests that the Abzu was a geopolitical territory, a network of underground water sources and caverns where the gods could keep a controlled environment.
This lines up with the lasting legends found in Tibet and India of Agartha or Shambhala, hidden kingdoms of sages who live deep within the earth, guarding ancient technologies and watching humanity from below.
These are not stories of the dead.
They are stories of the exiled. The Mesopotamian boundary stones clearly state that certain mountain peaks and territories were forbidden to human settlement.
Maybe these forbidden zones were the entrances to
the Abzu, the air shafts of a civilization that had moved its operations into the basement of the planet to survive the long winter of their imprisonment.
If they pulled back into the dark, they took their files with them.
The legends of the Andes talk about the Chiaos Caves, a huge underground network said to have a library of metal plates.
This matches with the descriptions of the tablets of destinies,
which weren't made of common clay, but shone like the stars, and held the rules of heaven and earth.
The priority of the Watchers was always the saving of the blueprints of civilization. Just as Thoth hid the books of knowledge before the flood, the pulling back into the earth likely involved the hiding of their most precious data. These underground libraries would be safe from the floods, the fires, and the shifting winds of the surface.
We may be walking over the true history of the world every day, unaware that the missing link in human evolution isn't buried in the mud,
but filed away in the watertight files of the Abzu, waiting for the quarantine to be lifted.
As the centuries of their being stuck wore on, the behavior of the Watchers changed.
In the earliest texts of Eridu, they are described as generous teachers,
giving the me of civilization freely to the people.
But in the later Akkadian and Babylonian records, the tone shifts. The gods become jealous, demanding, and hungry. They require daily sacrifices, strict obedience, and the smoke of the offering.
Why would a being able to travel in space need the smell of burning meat?
The prison theory offers a disturbing possibility. If their own biological life support systems were failing, they may have turned to the biochemistry of the earth for food.
The change from teacher to master marks the moment when humanity stopped being a student and became a resource.
The shepherd of the people was no longer guiding the flock.
He was harvesting it. The temples became collection points, not just for worship, but for the energy physical or otherwise needed to support the shrinking life force of the colony. The main builder of this harsher system was Enlil.
The texts describe him as a ruler,
obsessed with order and noise.
In the Atrahasis epic, he becomes upset because the noise of mankind has become too great, preventing him from sleeping. He argues for the reduction of the human population through plague, famine, and finally the
flood.
We have understood this as a story about divine punishment for sin.
But in the context of a prison, Enlil acts like a warden facing a riot.
The noise may not have been literal sound, but the chaotic expansion of a species that was becoming too
many to control.
Enlil's control was the air and the storm, and he used these forces as weapons of containment. He changed the weather patterns to destroy human settlements, making sure that the inmates remained weak and dependent. His philosophy was simple: a starving population doesn't rebel. The most real evidence of this parasitic relationship is found in the pyramid texts of Saqqara. Carved into the tomb of Unas is a text known as the Cannibal Hymn. It describes the
Pharaoh rising to the heavens not to worship the gods but to hunt them.
The text says he feeds on the gods and eats their magic to get their power.
For generations, Egyptologists have dismissed this as a barbaric symbol for spiritual rising. But if we take the text at its word, it describes a desperate transfer of biological essence.
The pharaoh eats the divine essence to inherit the long life and knowledge of the Watchers.
This suggests that by the time of the Old Kingdom, the gods were physical beings who could be hunted, killed, and eaten. It reveals a terrifying final chapter in the relationship, a world where the humans, bred to be servants, had turned on their masters, seeking to rip the immortality from their very bones.
The most lasting prison of the Watchers is not the earth itself, but the bodies of those they created.
The Atrahasis epic provides a recipe for humanity that is hauntingly specific.
It commands the birth goddess Nintu to mix the clay of the earth with the flesh and blood of a killed god.
The text identifies this god as Kingu, a being who had intelligence and wisdom.
This wasn't a symbolic act.
The text insists that the ghost
of the god would remain in the flesh of the new creature, making sure that the divine beat would never be forgotten. In the context of the prison theory, this is a mechanism of saving.
If the Anunnaki knew their own physical forms were failing, they transferred their essence, their intelligence, their memory, their spark into a new host. We are not just their servants, we are their lifeboats.
The ghost mentioned in the tablet is the sleeping consciousness of a civilization that couldn't survive in its original shell, hiding now within the clay of humanity.
The tragedy of this biological transfer is recorded in the Sumerian King List.
The first generation of this mixed family line, the rulers who ruled right after the flood, had lifespans and abilities that mirrored their creators.
They were the men of renown, the bridge between the mortal and the divine.
But the connection was unstable.
As the generations passed, the divine blood got weaker.
The lifespans crashed from centuries to decades.
The text suggests that the Watchers tried to keep this strength through the sacred marriage rituals and the selection of specific bloodlines for the priesthood. They were desperately trying to keep the signal clear to prevent the wisdom of Kingu
from fading into the background noise of human biology. But the earth was too strong.
The clay overwhelmed the blood.
The demigods became men, and the direct line to the knowledge of the first time was cut, leaving behind only a subconscious echo of a greatness we can no longer name.
Yet the texts imply that the essence was never destroyed. It was just silenced. The formulas of civilization weren't taught to us. They were unlocked within us.
The sudden explosions of human innovation, the appearance of math in Sumer, the building perfection of Egypt may not be discoveries but rememberings.
They are moments when the ghost of Kingu stirs in the clay. The prison of the gods may ultimately be a chrysalis. They lock themselves into the material world, binding their fate to ours.
We are the carriers of a code we didn't write, guardians
of a history that sleeps in our veins.
The Anunnaki didn't leave.
They are waiting for the day when the vessel is strong enough to hold the full weight of the memory.
Again, the golden cage isn't empty.
It is simply looking in the mirror.